Poole, co-founder of Reason Foundation. Amy has asked me to introduce our dinner speaker for tonight, Nick Gillespie, editor of Reason.com and Reason TV. And she also asked me to remind you all that this May 2013 will be the 45th anniversary of the start of Reason magazine. Pretty amazing milestone. Reason was started by a journalism student at Boston University, Lanny Friedlander, who died about a year ago. Strange kid, very creative, but just really disorganized. I learned about Reason magazine in its third issue and drove to Boston to meet Lanny and concluded that I was thinking maybe I would get involved in helping with this project because the country really needed a libertarian magazine. Oh, Jesus, this guy is so bizarre and so disorganized. I just didn't want to get involved in a project with him. But 6 months after that, I had written an article that he persuaded me to write. He made it the cover story of the September 1969 edition, and I was hooked somehow that journalism had power. And a year later, Tibor McCann, Manny Klausner, and I bailed out Lanny because he was out of money and Reason was about to go under. So we bought it from him in quotes, meaning we took over the liability to the 400 subscribers that he had accumulated and couldn't fulfill, and brought it to California. And January '71 was our first issue of this little partnership called Reason Enterprises. And we never missed an issue. Reason in 1970 had only, I think, published 3 issues because of money problems and disorganization, but we published on a regular monthly schedule from then on. In 1978, we finally decided that this was too big of a project. We built it to 10,000 circulation, too big of a project to do as a hobby business. And it needed to be something that a few of us could actually make a living at. And so we created Reason Foundation. We incorporated it in Santa Barbara and started with 3 employees. And today, thanks to David Knott, we have over 60 employees and this wonderful set of talents that you've all seen. Now, I don't really need to do much introduction of Nick, and all his bio is in the book and so forth, and I think you all know him. But I want to tell you a little story that made a big impression on me just a couple of weeks ago. I was in New York for I was in Washington for the huge annual Transportation Research Board conference. This brings about 11,500 people like me, policy wonks, academics, state DOT people, Federal Highway Administration people, and people, a lot of them from all over the world, for 5 intense days of presentations, committee meetings, and so forth on transportation. While I was there, I decided to have lunch with an old friend, Dan Elwell, who was the policy chief in the Federal Aviation Administration when Mary Peters was secretary during the second term of the Bush administration. Dan is a great guy. He's a former Air Force pilot, worked for American Airlines for many years, and he became policy chief at FAA. He was about to go to work for the Airline Trade Association. I really wanted to talk. Dan is a true believer in my ideas about air traffic control, what we need to do. So I figured, well, he's about to go to work for the airlines group. I should really have lunch with him and bring him up to date and just talk turkey. So we had a really nice lunch. We spent about 45 or 50 minutes talking about air traffic control. And then he said to me, Bob, I want to ask you about Reason Foundation. Is that the same thing as this Reason TV? So I had to explain to him, the whole organization, the different pieces and so forth. And then he says to me, this guy, he still had very short hair, he's about 50, the very sort of model of establishment Republican, you would assume from looking at him. He says, I see this guy, Nick Gillespie, on television all the time in his leather jacket, and he's so cool. He makes these free market ideas trendy and hip. And I said, he says, where did you find this guy? And so I'm so delighted that my straight-laced Republican friend thinks Nick Gillespie is making these ideas so cool. And I'm just very pleased to now give you our dinner speaker, Nick Gillespie.
Thank you, Bob. That's a very flattering story, and I I have two things to say before I start my talk, and the first is when I became editor-in-chief, I started with Reason in 1993 in the fall, and then I became editor-in-chief of the magazine in 2000, and the last hurdle was I had to have a conversation with Bob, and his first question to me is like, Nick, we think you could be a good editor and everything, but I got to ask you, do you believe in reality? Because of various things I'd written. I was like, yeah, I guess I do. I don't want to be held to that answer, but Bob put faith in me and signed off on the deal, so I was able to continue at work at Reason. So thank you very much for that, Bob. And it is, one of the things that is, and to hear about Reason's 45th anniversary, to know about that coming, I had started reading Reason when I was in high school. My older brother, went to college and discovered it at his college bookstore, started sending home to me, and then I later applied for a job. I was in grad school in Buffalo, and so I applied for a job that was listed in the, they said they needed an assistant editor, and I'd been a journalist before I went to grad school. And it was the dream job in all sorts of ways, and remains that, to actually be able to participate in a magazine that had actually really helped form all of my thoughts and all of my ideas about the world. And so again, Bob, thank you for creating this opportunity for all of us. The other thing I want to say, things, by the way, are looking up for Harrisburg, since Jim Epstein, who's not here tonight but is a great Reason TV producer, things are looking up because he reported today that a sinkhole developed in Harrisburg, and actually a bunch of buildings fell into it. So, and that's unfortunately about the best news that Harrisburg can hope for. And it's a city really where the survivors envy the dead. Okay, so I'm going to run through 5 unacknowledged, unexpected, and unavoidable facts about government spending and the economy. And then after, I hope I'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A about all sorts of whatever's on your mind. Okay, so the first fact, which is unacknowledged by many, is that we're spending too much. This is a chart of using 2005 dollars, and it's billions of dollars, the way that the government is spending. The actual numbers matter less than the overall trajectory, which you can see is incredibly high. We're spending a lot of money. This is total government spending. It's a different, before this is federal spending in 2005 dollars over basically the 21st century. And you can see things are up about 50% in absolute terms. This is total government spending, local, state, and federal government as a share of GDP. The big spike towards the, I guess it would be your left of the chart, that's World War II. And you can see we're coming down a little bit, but when you factor in all this, we're spending a hell of a lot of money. And that, when I said it's an unacknowledged fact, that's because we have dissenters or discontents about this, who include Barack Obama, who recently told John Boehner that we don't have a spending problem. And of course, Boehner is not a particularly reliable source. Unfortunately, this is a guy who, I live part-time in Ohio, and John Boehner is actually my congressman, but a couple of weeks before he became Speaker of the House in 2011, he was asked by NBC News to, could you say that we're spending too much money, could you name a program that should be cut? And he actually said on national news, I really can't think of anything off the top of my head. So it's like, but in any case, so some people say we're not spending too much. We don't have a spending problem. Jonathan Chait, a writer at New York Magazine, who Matt and I and various other Reason contributors wrangle with all the time online, he says there really isn't money to be cut everywhere. And then there's a kind of tell-all, and Matt has a great editorial in the the next to most recent issue about people who talk like this, but there's a regular construction that you will see again and again if you read the Beltway press, which is, we don't have a spending problem. What we have is a healthcare problem, or a defense problem, or an aging problem, or sunspots. That's the problem, but it's never spending. So that's an unacknowledged and unavoidable fact. Another unacknowledged and unavoidable and disturbing fact is that we've got too much debt. This is gross public debt, so that includes public debt held by the public in terms of bonds and things like that, as well as all of the money that the government owes to itself. So when the government takes the money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and spends it elsewhere and puts an IOU in there, this is all in that. And again, this is in absolute dollars or constant dollars. This is in percentage of GDP, but you can see where we've gone from starting at the 21st century, which, by the way, I don't know about any of you who grew up in the 20th century, but the 21st century was supposed to be pretty cool. And it really is not turning out quite the way that we envisioned. There's no jetpacks, there's no dog walks out on the side of your hover pod or anything like that from the Jetsons. But in 2000, debt as a percentage of GDP was about 55%. Now it's over 100% of GDP. This is gross public debt for state and local governments, and you can see something similar happened there. It's smaller, but it started at about 15% of GDP, and it got up to about 20%, and it's crested down a little bit because states basically used a lot of the stimulus money that they got to pay down some of their debt. It did not, as I think most of us understand, did not stimulate the economy quite the way as it was intended. And yet here you have more discontents talking about this. Larry Summers, who some of you, is anybody from Harvard here? Okay, I'll speak slower. But Larry Summers, governments that enjoy such low borrowing costs can improve their creditworthiness by borrowing more, not less. And you wonder, how did we get into this situation? It's just dumbfounding, isn't it? David Dine, a blogger at Firedog Lake, which is a left-wing site. We have a broad capacity to borrow loads of money at ultra-low rates. Government should capitalize on it. And then Paul Krugman, who some of you have heard of, constantly is talking about, well, look, if, the theory that he's presupposing is that if the government was borrowing so much, it would crowd out money for private investment and interest rates would go up. Interest rates are not going up so that we have not borrowed enough money, where we can keep borrowing and keep borrowing. This is the type of, this type of thing that, it sounds like these guys are mafia loan sharks. Don't worry, you'll be able to pay it back. You'll be able to pay it out. Why don't you take out more money? But here is the third fact, which is that debt overhang kills growth, and it doesn't necessarily show up in interest rates. This is the idea of debt overhang comes from a recent work by the economists Carmen and Vincent Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. And Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff also wrote an excellent book recently about financial crises over centuries. But they define debt overhang as moments when the gross public debt to GDP ratio is greater than 90% for at least 5 years. We're in that, according to their understanding of things. Debt overhang episodes, these periods of 5 years or more, are associated with growth over 1% lower than during other periods. So when your debt to GDP ratio gets above 90% for a period of time, it lowers economic growth for a long time. They looked at 26 cases going back over the past couple hundred years. The average duration of reduced growth is about 23 years, so that for 23 years you have average growth that is going to be 1% or more less than it would have been absent that much debt. Then they also, and I'll just summarize this, but that basically what they said is that this is true even when interest rates don't spike up, which is a kind of conventional or traditional understanding of the way that economic forces would work. And what this means, this is a figure, a table, or a chart rather, which shows what that really means to say that, okay, if you have a debt overhang period, this is how much economic growth suffers as a result. And without the debt overhang is the blue line up there, and you can see just over a 23, 24-year period, a quarter of a century, a generation, for God's sake, you would start at 100 and you would be up above 220 if you have the reduced growth rate, it's the red line down there below. And, think of that slice between those two lines as all of the jobs that are missing, all of the forward momentum, all of the college, all of the education, all of the improvement, all of the unemployment, all of the wasted human capital and lives. That's what's coming, because we're in that, and it's not clear exactly how you get out of that so quickly. So, now that we've gone through some bad news, I want to talk about some, again, surprising facts. One thing that is particularly interesting is that, and I think this is a minor sign of hope, which is that real per capita GDP or spending by the federal government has been flat. This is a chart put together by Veronique de Rougy, an economist at the Mercatus Center. She's also a Reason columnist, and I had actually asked her a while ago to do this, which what this does is it looks at per capita using inflation-adjusted dollars, real dollars, per capita. What are the spending patterns over the past 35, 40 years? And what shows here, which is pretty interesting, is that there's a reliable trend, which is that under Democratic presidents, spending tends to be relatively flat, real spending, when you adjust for inflation and population, tends to be flat, and the growth periods come under Republican presidents. And certainly, if you look at the second George W. Bush, that was very much the case. And even when you see Obama, there's that big jump up. Even part of that spending is due to George Bush and the late in his final term, things like the TARP bailout and whatnot. Some of that was sloughed into 2009 spending, which then got goosed even more by things like Obama's stimulus and whatnot. But this, I would argue, is a good sign. I mean, it's awful that we have this, ziggurat of doom going up here, but there's every reason to believe that Obama, or the country, is not going to be able to actually increase spending in the near term very much. I mean, we have to fight on this, but people are starting to understand more and more what's going on, and partly because they're understanding that spending growth is being driven by entitlement spending, that this is, which is something that people don't fully understand most of the time. But this is data that was put together by Nate Silver of the New York Times. He runs the 538 blog there, and he cuts and slices data in lots of interesting ways. But and he's a kind of conventional liberal, and when he looked at this is the type of thing that Reason has been reporting for 10 years, 20 years. When somebody in the New York Times says it's news, but what he found was that you look at annualized growth rates from 1972 through 2011, and you can see entitlement programs growing by almost 5% a year. Infrastructure and services went up by about 3%. Defense 2%, interest 3.4%, and boy, we're going to get slammed when interest rates do go up. They are historically low, and that will not hold forever. But total government spending over that period went up by 3.4%, again, driven mostly by entitlement programs. GDP less than 3%, and that's a big part of our problem, is that when you have spending that's growing faster than the economy, you start getting into a situation where government spending keeps growing, but the economy doesn't. Now, what Silver said, though, and what's interesting, and this goes back to an earlier chart, what he noticed, though, is that when you think about it in terms of entitlement spending, that's the big shift, and that's the blue part down here, and you can see the blue part is what's growing. Up through, really 1960, entitlement spending wasn't that big a deal. There was basically only Social Security and some welfare payments. By 1970, Medicare and Medicaid had come fully online, and then, and what's interesting about this chart is that this doesn't count Obamacare coming on, and it doesn't count massive increases in Medicare in particular that are coming very quickly. But basically, the role of the federal government has shifted from being one of doing infrastructure and services and defense to becoming what he said is an insurance broker. And he looked at the fact that since the early 70s, trust and confidence in government had been going down at the very same time that government spending had shifted dramatically towards entitlement or to social insurance. And he noted in his piece, most of us don't care much for our insurance broker, which I take as a good sign. because we don't care for our insurance broker, and so we're less likely to do business with them. We don't trust the government very much. This is a Gallup poll that was taken last fall, and the dark green line is people who think that the government most of the time, can you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? The dark green line are the people, I think they're colloquially known as suckers. They are people who think the government is trying to do the best they can or does a pretty good job most of the time. It's dropping. It's down at 19% now, whereas the people who are more skeptical of government power and government's ability to address all the ills in the world is rising. And that's a good thing because these are preconditions to how we get out of the situation we're in, primarily by reducing the debt to GDP ratio, which is a good thing because people don't only not trust the government, but they want to reduce the debt. This is from the most recent Reason Root poll, and this should give us cause for optimism. It's not time to celebrate yet because we haven't made these structural changes, but we're getting closer there. If, as David had said early on, that the prerequisite, last night, the prerequisite for change is a felt need for change. We're doing a lot of feeling these days. 75% think that the debt is budget deficits and debts that result from that is a major problem that the country must address now. That's good news because that means that there is a growing recognition that we cannot keep spending money that we don't have on projects that we don't need. And that is the precondition for political change. And I'm going to end now just with some quick lines of argument about, okay, so if it's true we need to reduce the debt to GDP ratio in order to keep the economy growing faster, because this debt overhang will tamp down growth for, it could be a quarter of a century before we get out of that situation. We have to reduce debt to GDP quickly. The best way to do that, and this is also in the Reinhardt, and Rogoff paper, the best way to do that is not by raising taxes, because that's one way to minimize deficits, but it's to cut spending. They found that in many cases that was actually stimulative of the economy. Certainly was after World War II, where there were major cuts in government spending, and the economy, rather than tanking, took off like nobody's business. But what are the lines of argument for cutting spending? There's here are some questions that I suggest you ask friends, politicians, business leaders, Eskimos, whatever, Indian chiefs. But, what do we have to show for a 50% increase in federal spending since 2001? And by the way, $6 to $7 trillion overall in stimulus. When you add up all the bailouts and when you add up all the quantitative easing rounds and things like that, we've spent almost half of the economy, of an annual economy, to make the economy grow again, and it's not working. It hasn't worked. Do you want to screw your kids over that badly? Because what's driving debt is Medicare and Social Security, which goes, regardless of need, to people who hit a certain number. And that is money that is coming out of your children's pockets in the form of payroll taxes, and they're paying for programs that will not be there when they retire, or if they are there, starting in 2010, basically everybody who retires on Social Security is guaranteed to get less out of the program than they put in. That's a reversal of the way that the program had always been. So we're basically, this is the question to ask your kids. Why would you trust anyone over 55? Because they're forcing you to pay into entitlement programs that are not going to be there for you or treat you worse than, the worst kind of retirement advisor you might have. Here's another one, because a lot of debt and a lot of spending goes to public sector pensions and public sector compensation, which is at every level, when you control for the age, for the experience, for the education level, for the private sector analogs, people in the public sector are doing better than in the private sector. Do you know that only 15%, and that's even a kind of high estimate, work for the public sector? Why are we, for 15% work for the public sector? I'm sorry, that's a typo, thank you very much. Or in the public sector, we are brokering or mortgaging our future for 15% of workers who are making out better than the rest of us in the private sector. It just doesn't make sense. And then finally, to the politicians, do you want to get reelected? Because this is the change point, and we saw this with the Tea Party. When they held politicians accountable for their wicked spending ways and turned politicians out, politicians responded by actually listening and starting to talk more. There's a reason why we are now having debates over debt ceiling increases, and why people like Rand Paul or Mike Lee, Tea Party senators, are able to put in budgets or push for balanced budget amendments and things like that. And it is because politicians are like, they're like criminals in Batman comics. They're a superstitious, cowardly lot. And the minute that they know that they are going to lose elections because they are spending too much money, they will find their inner cheapskate and they'll start coming down. So, and with that, I'll leave it and we can take some questions. So thank you.
Hi, Nick. I have a question.
Yes.
Would you consider the post-World War II deficit reduction austerity? And is that what is required right now? And if so, how do you think the country is going to react? And will it be similar to what's going on with the protests in parts of Europe like Greece?
This is also an interesting debate about austerity measures. And austerity, which is best understood as an attempt to reduce debt to GDP ratio. There are different ways you can do it. You can do it by cutting spending. You can do it by raising taxes. You can do it by a mix of the two. A lot of people have said, look, in places like Greece and places like England, austerity has been tried. They've cut spending by massive amounts. And it just hasn't worked. They're worse off than ever. When you look at virtually any of those, actually, when you look at all of those cases, the fact of the matter is that spending has not been reduced. Taxes have gone up. And that's, that is, austerity is generally, it gets pilloried as cutting social services to the bone and giving tax breaks to the rich. In fact, austerity, as it's been practiced in most places, is just hiking taxes and keeping spending constant or actually increasing. And then when you look at countries that have recently done differently, and this includes places like Canada in the 90s, Sweden has done this, New Zealand has done this, all within recent memory, when they cut spending, and typically they would cut spending by about, for every dollar in new revenue they might raise through taxes, they cut spending by like $6 or more. And their economies right-sized very quickly and everybody was better off.
The one part that I get stumped with my progressive friends is in the discussions of the unsustainability. And for 30 years, we've said that it can't keep going. And Paul Krugman says, of course, it can keep going. And so what answer can I give to my dear progressive friends that it is going to end at some point?
Well, yeah, this is, the analogy, and I think it came up at dinner as well, as that, when you jump out of a building from the 100th floor, everything is pretty good right up until about the 99th floor and, just before you hit the ground. But this is where actually I think the understanding of the debt overhang is helpful, because what that formulation shows is that spending, taking out massive amounts of debt, even if it's low interest, so it's a bargain and things like that, it does have an effect, because people know, everybody involved knows deep down that you're going to have to pay that money back one way or another, and you're either going to do it by making that debt cheaper by by inflating, or you're just going to have to pony up the money. And so the idea of, what is unsustainable ultimately is having unemployment, creeping around 8% for year after year after year. And you can point to other countries that did reduce their debt to GDP ratio overwhelmingly by cutting spending, and those economies take off, the ones that don't.
Nick, there's in your prepared remarks, you use the phrase a couple of times, we shouldn't be having spending that we can't afford, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I would sort of prefer to modify the message, because the spending on the wrong things, whether or not we could afford it, is bad.
Sure.
And I think on spending, the issue is what you're spending on, because the issue of can we afford it is far too squirrely. And an argument can always be made that we can afford it, just raise taxes or borrow.
Right.
So if you say spending is okay if we can afford it, I don't agree with that. I think that's a bad part of the mantra. And the second comment is the trying to persuade elected officials that spending money on public employees, we don't get a lot of value, is it's a silly argument in the sense that they would acknowledge, they being the spenders, that it's not a question of value, it's vote buying. Spending money on teachers is simply vote buying. And nobody pretends that it's buying something of value, it's buying re-election.
Well, two things, and thank you for the earlier point. That you're right, that just because you can afford something doesn't mean that you should go out and purchase it. And, one of the ways to talk about this type of stuff is when you start to look, and, this is other work that I've done recently, one of the main drivers of runaway government spending, I mean, there are numerous ones, but major ones include things like defense spending. Defense spending is up about 70% from where it was in 2001. And you can argue, okay, after 9/11, everything changed. But then at some point, did it change where we're spending 70% more in real dollars? And are the threats worse to us now than they were, say, in 2001? It's hard to justify any of that. But the main drivers are things like Medicare, which is health care for elderly people or people over 65, Social Security also, which is in a bad financial situation. And the fact of the matter is that most seniors are in much, much better condition financially than virtually any other aspect of the population. And so to blindly say that because you're 65 you deserve Medicare without any question about that is wrong, and certainly the financing mechanism is horrible where it's unfair. So I do think you're right, Bob, to always be pushing that way. To talk about buying votes and whatnot, this is the thing. Again, public employees do not rule the world. I mean, sometimes it feels that way, and most politicians think that. But the fact is that there are more people who are on the short end of this stick, and that actually can change if we start pushing this. And again, one of the things I'm sure a lot of you were taught growing up, well, if you have to get a civil service job because the pay is no good, but you have decent job security and you get good benefits. What has happened over the past few years as finances have gotten tough and more data has been kind of dug through and everything, is that people now realize that that's wrong, because actually you have great job security, you have an absolute Cadillac plan for benefits for health care and retirement, and you get paid more than your private sector analog. And that's pissing people off, and that's one of the reasons why people like Scott Walker in Wisconsin is able to actually not only take on public sector compensation, but actually win recall elections. So.
Hi, Nick. It's Walt back here. Listen, I agree with everything you've said, and I agree with all the data, except your first, your number one problem is spending. Mm-hmm. And then number four, you put up a slide that you said someone else gave it to you. I think a progressive think tank gave it to you, because it says,
no, it's not.
It says, spending's up over the last 4 years. We can bring back, the spending's up like 30% over the last 4 years, yet spending per capita, you said, is flat. I don't think that can't be possible.
Why not?
Well, that means
I did say
the
these are
population,
unexpected, right?
The population would have to grow 30% in the last 4 years. It would have to be completely relative, and it's not. Population hasn't grown 30% in 4 years.
Federal outlays per capita in inflation-adjusted dollars. For instance, in the fiscal year 2012, the federal government actually spent less money than it did in fiscal year 2011. And this is the upside of a dysfunctional government that can't write a budget. Essentially what happened, because the government spending was done through continuing resolutions, there was not an opportunity to actually jack up spending. So those figures, by the way, are drawn from the, the historical budget tables of the OMB. There's no question about that. And it's interesting, and to, dig deep into that, because if you are pro-Republican, the Republicans have a lot of explaining to do. And it's interesting, progressives who think that the Democrats are great because they give away the bank, Democrats also have something to explain. But this is largely a function of the fact that Obama got a big increase coming in, and then since then, they haven't, there hasn't been a federal budget in, coming up on 4 years. And that meant that it's actually very difficult to spend more money.
We're going to fit in 2 more questions here. I see you, Jerry.
In your great book, Why Libertarian Politics Can Solve the Problems, I believe something along those lines, available at Amazon.com. You talked about, you and Matt talked about the government being out of money. This, you wrote this in 2010, and here we are in January, February of 2013, and the government continues on all levels to be able to finance itself, state, local, and federal, helped by $1 trillion a year of federal or of Fed money printing. Have you thought through the end game of that, and at what point do you think the one or more levels of government will no longer be able to finance themselves?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting question, and I think Matt would agree with me on this. One thing we didn't anticipate, we thought when we went out and talked about things that people would be like, yeah, you're right, we are out of money, and we got to change now. And it turned out that that message had not really sunk through, or people understand it, but I don't know how many of you have either been bankrupt or extremely poor at various points where, it takes you a while to realize, like when you're out of money, that you can't keep doing everything that you've been doing. And that, I think, we're still in this phase where we're still fully kind of grokking the idea that we are broke and we have to change our spending almost immediately. I do think that you're starting to see, the canaries in the coal mine are cities that are going bankrupt that Julian and Adrian talked a bit about. Places like Harrisburg, the credit ratings on a bunch of states as well as on the federal government have gone down. So the early signs are there, but at a certain point, this is one of the problems with credit crunches and with bankruptcies and things like that. Everything is okay until suddenly it isn't. And this, as much as anything, is these are Cassandra calls to stop before it's really totally irredeemable.
We have time for one last question over here.
Nick, what were you up to when you were 4 years old, and what has happened since then?
Am I allowed to curse, use profanity in the, I don't, Jerry, you're going to have to give me a little more to work with on that? Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.